Hello, my name is Anne Stuart, and I'm a retired police officer from the Metropolitan Police. I served 34 years in the Met Police, and the last 20 of those I worked in child protection. I performed 3 roles. I was an investigator for a few years, then I wrote policy and procedures, and then I took over the training team where we delivered specialist child witness interviewing and the Specialist Child Abuse Investigation Development Programme to obviously officers and detectives who were to investigate child abuse. I finally retired in 2014 and became an independent safeguarding consultant. I currently teach and train adults who work closely with children and young people how to respond safely to concerns, which obviously is really key at this present time in terms of safeguarding. I also teach police officers up until the COVID. I was teaching police officers how to interview children and young people whilst I worked for an organisation called Triangle, which is based in Sussex. And my experience and passion is to show adults how it's okay, how it is safe to be able to talk to children, but also pass on some essential things to think about, if certainly from a policing perspective, what you need to think about when it comes to interviewing a child or a young person. Well, interestingly enough, I actually got into child protection by default. It wasn't an area of work that I actually wanted to go in. Initially, I worked in domestic violence in the East End of London at Limehouse Police Station, and I'd never thought child protection was going to be the last thing on my mind, because it meant that I would have to work closely with social workers. And this was back in the early 1990s. But circumstances in my career sort of changed and pushed me in that direction of working in child protection. And actually it seemed fate took a hand in that, and it was probably one of my best career moves that I made. I suppose there are a number of reasons why I'm passionate about child protection and safeguarding, and particularly in terms of interviewing, because I do think that it's something that, particularly in the police, we're not very good at. Even as adults, we're not perhaps very good at talking to children. And I've learned a lot through interaction with my nieces, my young niece. And it was actually an experience I had with my young niece that made me realise that actually a lot of police officers perhaps don't appreciate the developmental cognitive skills that children don't have or are still developing when it comes to us to interviewing them. And I just really want to pass the message. We just need to think differently when we come to talking to young children. And it's something that I'm still very passionate about. Well, in the forensic context, I understand that a 2.5-year-old child was interviewed. The child had witnessed her father murdering her mother, in essence. And what we needed, I wasn't involved in the interview, but what I understand was required was for the child to identify who else was in the room, and she was able to do that. Obviously, the interview took place actually at Triangle with an intermediary, which was vital for a child of that age, of course. But they were successful in being able to identify who else was in the room when the incident took place. I think since then there's been another one that recently made the news with another 2.5-year-old, where an intermediary was able to obtain DNA that helped support an investigation. So yes, 2.5 is certainly the youngest child I'm aware of that's been spoken to. Well, I think one of the key differences, first and foremost, I think it's important to reiterate the definition that in the Youth Justice and Criminal Evidence Act 1999 about that relates to victims and witnesses. And we know that a child and young person, in terms of vulnerable victims and witnesses, is any person under the age of 18. And we have to understand that actually the interview techniques that are appropriate perhaps for interviewing an adult who is cognitively and psychologically more developed than a child, when it comes to interviewing children, they are less so. So therefore we need to be aware of things like that children are still developing their memory skills, for example. Young children particularly may know words but not necessarily understand their meaning. They haven't got as many words stored in their memory, which is why they'll often show in their behaviour more than actually using their words. And even with the words they do have, they may struggle in using the ones that they actually do know. And actually children may need time and more than one opportunity to be able to develop that sufficient trust. So rapport is absolutely vital. And whilst rapport is often spoken about as a requirement in terms of the 4 phases of doing an MBE interview, you can't underestimate rapport building with the necessity for rapport building with children and young people, and even adults. Actually, rapport building is very important. And I just want to take a moment for people to think about, this is something that I've used in training in the past. And if I was to ask you, whoever is listening to this particular recording, if I was to say to you, we've never met, this is the first time we've met, and I would like you to tell me in as much detail as possible about your first sexual experience. And you are being asked to describe that in detail to a complete stranger. Now, one would hope that for you, that your first sexual experience would have been perhaps pleasurable. But from a policing perspective, when we're dealing with rape victims or children and young people who are victims of sexual assault, then actually it's unlikely, very unlikely, to be pleasurable. In fact, it's more likely to be traumatic. And then they've got to sit in front of you and give you detail about that experience. So we have to be able to see it from a victim's perspective, how difficult and challenging it can be for them who hold that information that we need to be able to tell, in essence, a complete stranger. So to be able to break that down, you need to build rapport. Rapport is absolutely vital, and rapport may have to be done over a few hours, maybe a couple of days, but it is absolutely essential to build that trust, whether it's a young child, a young person, or even a vulnerable adult. Building rapport is absolutely vital. Well, when you start building rapport, that rapport begins the moment you meet that person or that child or young or vulnerable adult. And I don't know that you can succinctly describe rapport building, because actually you can build rapport and trust in a moment, or it might take time. So a lot of it will depend on the child or young person or the adult who you are, who you need to engage with to be able to gain their confidence, for them to feel comfortable in talking to you about their adverse experience. So I don't think it can necessarily be put in a nutshell. Time is of the essence, but you've also got to be aware of it sounds dark, but be aware of people. And every person you come across, every child or young person you come across and meet will be different. And the time needed to build that rapport will be different. So that I don't think you can necessarily have a set of rules, because those set of rules aren't going to fit everybody in who we might meet in terms of interviewing or through our investigations. You just need to be aware that rapport is essential to be able to help that person feel comfortable in telling you about their experience. Well, of course, children can be suspects as well, so it goes back to still understanding sort of cognitive ability and psychological development and their background, etc. How are they different? Well, I think you still need to plan. In some cases, in terms when it comes to interviewing suspects, there's a suggestion that you should still try and build rapport and trust. So that still sort of is the same across all areas. You still have outcomes that you need to reach, but obviously when you're interviewing suspects, you're hoping to get a confession, or for them to admit their guilt if indeed they are guilty. But often we find with suspect interviews, it's usually a no comment interview. So I think it's because of the outcomes that makes them different, but actually your approach would still be very, very similar. As I said earlier, you would still need to plan. You definitely need to plan for suspects interviews, and you should certainly plan for interviews of victims and witnesses. To have the ability to interview victims and witnesses is absolutely vital if you want to be able to obtain your evidence on top of perhaps other forensic evidence that you may already have, to be able to then interview your suspect. So actually, it's as vital, if not more vital, to be able to be good and skillful at interviewing victims and witnesses, to be able to achieve best evidence, to be able to then place that evidence to your suspect when it comes to interviewing. So whether one is more important than the other, I think they're equally important. And I think police officers have got to understand that. And I suppose in terms of suspect interviewing, you've got the PACE framework, and there's a lot of expectation in terms of how you should approach it, which is sort of set in forms of legislation and procedures. But actually we have the Victims Code of Practice, and we also have the aiding guidance, which if we follow that is just as important and skillful to be able to know and understand, and just as important. So I don't think there's one more important than the other. I think they're both sort of equal. But what I don't understand is this belief that having the skills to be able to interview suspects is more important than having skills to be able to actually interview vulnerable victims and witnesses. They are both of equal level. And that's why now, in terms of the College of Policing, you'll have achieving best evidence at level 1, which is what referred to as your volume crime. So that's PIP level 1, used to be called tier 1. You then have PIP level 2, which is your serious and complex crime, and the ability to be able to investigate suspects and vulnerable witnesses. But also at PIP level 2, you have specialists. So you have specialist child witness interviewers, you have specialist vulnerable witness interviewers. So they are additional courses on top of other interview training that you may have already had. And the same applies to suspects interviewing. So I think, as years have progressed, there's this realisation that actually there's a parallel between the two. They're all important. It's all important to be able to be skillful at interviewing victims and witnesses, and to be skillful at interviewing suspects. But I have a firm belief that actually each individual officer and interviewer has to be able to take on board their own abilities and their own preferences, because there are courses for horses, as they say, and you can send somebody on a course, a specialist child witness interview course, but that doesn't necessarily mean they're going to be good at interviewing children, because I think there is a personal skill set, a preference within yourself of where you're more likely to lean to in terms of what you prefer interviewing, whether it's suspects or victims or witnesses. I hope that makes sense. So that is something we have to take on board. So I'll give you an example. Obviously, I worked in child protection, and yes, it was a number of years ago. I'll take that on board as well. But when it came to very young children, I would stay clear from them. I didn't feel comfortable or have the ability to interview young children at that time. There were other people in my office that had that ability, and so they tend to be asked to interview the very young children. Give me any child over the age of 10, no problem at all. I felt more comfortable and I had the ability to do that. And part of that perhaps was fear, because I didn't then have an understanding of cognitive ability, language, child development, all of those other things. We weren't taught that then. And I didn't have the confidence in that. Then I needed to take that on board myself, because if I don't have the confidence and you're going to give me a 4 or 5-year-old to interview, I'm not perhaps going to do that child justice, because I know in myself that I don't have the skills. But obviously, as years went by, I developed those skills and I developed more confidence. So actually, sometimes as ourselves, personally, we have to look at ourselves and understand our own abilities, and then decide whether we want to improve those in a specific area. I hope that makes sense. I think what's always important with regards to forensic interviewing, particularly of children, is to understand where it's all originated from. And I think the listeners to this recording and the viewers of this video would find it helpful to review the Cleveland inquiry, which is dated 1987. And I know that sounds an awfully long time ago, but actually, as a result of that particular case, is the reason why here in the UK, or certainly in England and the rest of the UK, we visually record interviews of children and young people, which has now since evolved to include vulnerable adults. Now, the Cleveland inquiry in 1987, there was 100 plus children who had been taken into care with concerns around sexual abuse. And there was real issues amongst many. One of the issues was the number of times children had to speak about their experience. And as a result, there was a lot of additional information or conflicting information. And this is a real brief summary of this overview. But in essence, as a result of this particular inquiry, the Memorandum of Good Practice was developed and written. And this good practice was a guide as for police officers and social workers as to how to interview children and young people, to allow the children to only have to tell about their experience one time, and to get it recorded so they didn't have to keep repeating their experience to other adults and statutory agencies. And this Memorandum of Good Practice was introduced around about 1989 in the UK, and has evolved since then to become the ABE, what we now refer to as Achieving Best Evidence Guidance, which is a national guidance for police in terms of interviewing vulnerable witnesses. But it's also for those who may be listening who are in the UK to remember that actually the visually recording of interviews of children and young people isn't just for criminal courts, because those interviews are also used for family proceedings. And it's absolutely vital that we actually remember that it's not all about having a successful conclusion to a court. It's actually about fulfilling our duty to safeguard and protect children. And we do that by interviewing children about their experiences, which will either support a successful, perhaps a successful case in a criminal court, or it might support and protect them in terms of family proceedings and safeguard them, which of course is our duty. So it's two-pronged when we do our visually recorded interviews. It is for criminal proceedings in the UK, but those recordings can also be used for family proceedings. And the issue around the Cleveland was actually touched on memory as well, because with memory, when you recall something and you sort of bring it out and look at it once, when you keep bringing that memory out to look at it, so to speak, it will change, it can change, it's vulnerable to change, and it's something that the brain does automatically. It's not a conscious change that is made. And that is why the guidance really supports the view that interviewing children allows them just to be able to tell their experience or talk about their experience just the once. Now, that doesn't mean that you wouldn't do more than one interview. If you were to do a second interview, it would have to be as a result of additional information. You would not explore stuff that you've already explored at the risk of possible confliction or a lack of continuity or whatever might occur. So that'd be worth looking at and reading. Cleveland Inquiry 1987, Dame Butler Slosh and Lord Piggott was involved in that and developing the Memorandum of Good Practice, which has since evolved to Achieving Best Evidence, the ABE guidance currently used in the UK, which can be found on the Crown Prosecution Service's website. When it comes to interviewing children, and I think one of the useful aspects, you remember I had mentioned that we shouldn't be put off interviewing a child just because of their age, or just because they may have a communication impairment, or just because that we might not be able to understand them. Because we know from experience that children will also use non-verbal behaviour to try and tell or show what their experiences have been. And just to give you an example, I won't mention the name of the case, it will not be appropriate, but there was a case, a 3-year-old child who was interviewed a few years ago, who had been sexually abused by a member of the family on a number of occasions. And when you first hear her talking, you would think, oh, I don't understand what she's saying. It's really, really difficult to communicate. She's not having the words. She can't really string words together to make a proper sentence. And there might be some officers, some interviewers who think, no, this is not going to go anywhere. Now, in actual fact, with this particular young child, she had already been interviewed by the police on 2 or 3 occasions unsuccessfully. And then an intermediary was brought in. And as a result of the use of an intermediary and appropriate questions being asked, appropriate assessment being carried out in terms of what she can understand or not understand, and some scaffolding tools being used, such as drawing. Drawing was a key element in this interview. So much so that when she was asked questions about what happened, while she was not able to use her words, she was able to use her drawings and her actions, and when she was pointing to certain things on her pictures, was really very, very powerful, and it was absolutely clear that she had been sexually abused. Now, the point of me telling you about this story was there'd be some who'd say, well, she may have been able to do that in an interview, but there's no way she'd be able to be cross-examined. And so you have to ask yourself a question, but if this child or young person, or even a vulnerable adult, might not initially appear to have the communication skills to be able to communicate how we would like effectively, but can still be able to tell their experience through other supporting formats, we should not be thinking, actually, I'm not going to bother with this interview because there's no way she's going to be cross-examined in court. That's just not going to happen. But that shouldn't be our thinking. Our initial thinking has to be, we need to support this person to be able to tell their experience, because if it can be so powerful, just like in this particular case I was talking about earlier, that we know suspects or defendants get to see the evidence that's going to be presented. That includes a visually recorded interviews of victims and witnesses, or the transcripts of such. And in this particular case, the transcript of this young 3-year-old was viewed by the defendant, and as a result he pleaded guilty in court, which negated the need for her to have to be cross-examined. So the point and the moral of that story is, we as interviewers and investigators must do all that we can to be able to support a child, young person or vulnerable adult to be able to communicate their experience. We need to use an intermediary or other scaffolding tools such as drawing, etc. And we should be doing that, because you never know how powerful and what impact that's going to have on a defendant's final plea at court. So we shouldn't dismiss their abilities just because we think they're not going to be suitable to be cross-examined. One of the things that you must not do when interviewing children, first and foremost, children are not little adults. I think parents have a wonderful, endearing way of wanting to refer their children as aren't they growing up fast, they're like little adults. Well, when it comes to interviewing, children are not little adults. So I think it's important, particularly with young children, is this expectation to, right, you sit here, look at me when I'm talking to you, keep still, don't do this, don't do that. And actually with young children, they're more likely to be free with their narrative if they don't feel so stilted. And sometimes it's not actually very practical to make a child sit still and look at you. And I take on board, there's probably somebody watching this saying, yes, but the judges at the court like to have the head, shoulders, the top of the head and shoulders of the victim or witness on the screen so that they can be seen, so that the jury can see facial expressions, etc. Absolutely, and I don't disagree with that. However, when it comes to interviewing children, you have to be more flexible, and that is why you have another camera in the room that has the whole room. So if the child does move around, does get distracted, does sit go and stand behind a sofa or hide behind a cushion or whatever it is they might do, you're still capturing it on camera. And I think you've just got to be flexible to how they're going to be in the interview. There are ways that you can try and keep them still, but telling them to sit still, look at me when I'm talking to you is an approach that you really should avoid, because you're then putting the child under pressure. Don't ignore the possibility of having to have an intermediary. If you need an intermediary, you've really got to consider having an intermediary. Furthermore, in terms of interviewing children, don't assume the children will understand all your questions. Don't ask long, complicated questions. Don't use police jargon or long words, because children will have words in their head, but they may not necessarily understand them. Don't assume that children are going to be able to answer concept questions. And as interviewers, we can get wrapped up in needing to know the complete day, date, time and place, particularly time. Was it morning? Was it afternoon? Was it 3 o'clock? Was it 2 o'clock? And in terms of time, they can be very difficult questions for children to answer accurately. So sometimes you may have to think to actually avoid them altogether, or think of other ways of being able to ascertain that information. In terms of concept questions, it is easy obviously for adults to understand concept questions, but children do have that difficulty. Avoid expressive language. How lovely it is when you're with young children and they do something well. We go, oh, wow, well done, thank you. And actually we got to, although that's a natural response, if a child does something well or whatever, we need to try and actually avoid that expressive language when it comes to interviewing children, because it's an encouragement. And the risk is that you'll encourage them to tell you more or give you more information that may not actually be accurate. So if they do something that's well, don't need to say, well done, that's really good. Just say thank you. And don't be overly expressive. And you need to be like that both in rapport building as well as in the interview. And I mean, there are a number of things, other things that you'd be advised to avoid. And one other actually is saying okay is not okay. And okay is a word that's very prolific in our language. We use it a lot. We use it in conversation to indicate that we've understood what we've heard, or that we are listening to you. So we'll say okay. Now, the reason why in training we encourage adults not to say okay is because if a victim or witness was to say, and then he raped me, or then he touched my private parts, and then you say, okay, actually that's not okay. And as semantic as it may sound, some of you may or may not have seen a panorama program many years ago. It was around domestic violence on the Isle of Wight. Body-worn camera images were shown, and when the police arrived, there's a police officer inside the house talking to the man, the perpetrator, And then there was a police officer outside in the garden talking to the victim, a woman who was at that time in her 60s. And you could see all her injuries on her face. And this police officer was listening and making a note of what she was saying. And she was given a description of what she'd experienced in terms of the violence that she was experiencing from her husband. And this officer kept saying, okay. And now for her, what she's doing is indicating the fact that she's listening. And then at one point, the woman said, but it's not okay. And it sort of makes you think that whilst we use that term to acknowledge that we're listening, we have to be mindful of the fact how that might then be interpreted by your victim or witness. So the best thing is to try and avoid saying it altogether. Other things to remember when it comes to interviewing child victims and witnesses is that you must not underestimate the ability of a child to be able to tell you, regardless of their age or communication ability. Young children or children with communication impairment often are seen as the problem because of their developmental limitations. And our own unconscious bias is something that we need to be aware of when it comes to not just actually young children with communication impairments, but actually vulnerable adults. There's also, don't assume that they're not going to be able to comply with interview protocols. And don't assume that young children or children with communication impairments are going to be poor communicators. And that's why we have intermediaries. Intermediaries are there to help support you. When the strength of young children is underestimated, and an understanding that communication is actually a two-way street, because a child's competence is very dependent on the adult's competence. And that's why it goes back to what I was saying earlier about understanding and knowing your own abilities and understanding. And if you don't feel competent in interviewing a very young child, or even a child who's autistic or has any other form of communication impairment, then you have a duty to that child or young person to seek advice and support from an intermediary. Now, I mentioned earlier about not asking long, complicated questions and not to use police jargon. So I just want to give you an example. This is when you're asking questions, you're relying on somebody's auditory working memory. So, for example, so your auditory working memory is something that you're using in the here and now. So, for example, if you stop and ask somebody for instructions, you're going to use your auditory working memory to take on board those directions that someone's given you to be able to get to where you need to go. Now, adults can hold up to 6 to 8 items in their auditory working memory, whereas children often can hold a lot less. So, for example, young children's auditory working memory depends on their age as to how much information they can hold in their mind before responding to your question. So, for example, you may ask, when you were at the park before the man came, what were you doing? So a 4-year-old may only process park and what you're doing and actually miss the time reference. A 3-year-old may only hear park, man and doing. So you need to be mindful. Then goes back to question types and keeping your questions and language simple. Don't make your questions complicated, and be mindful of the child's auditory working memory. And the younger they are, the less number of words they will be able to hold on to when you ask that question. Look it up and learn about auditory working memory, particularly when it comes to children. And that should help you understand the need to keep your questions short and simple. Interestingly enough, it's a question that's often asked in training, and what participants on a course tend to respond to is, getting the evidence and getting the child to disclose and tell us everything that we need. But actually what interviewers have to ensure they try and do is start with the basics. And it goes back to what we were talking about before, which is rapport building. Rapport building, understanding child's language, how well do they respond to your questions, can they understand what you're asking them. You know, many interviewers are not necessarily, which is why intermediaries are so important, because if you haven't had any training to be able to assess the child's language, then you're going to need an intermediary, because you need to be able to obtain some understanding of the child's receptive and expressive language. So receptive communication is, can this child understand me? And expressive communication is, can I understand this child? And doing some form of language assessment is absolutely vital. And that's all part of your rapport building. And that can be achieved through doing a practice interview or practice recall. Now, let's be absolutely clear, this is also part of your rapport building. The current ABE guidance talks about rapport building and the importance of understanding child development and cognitive ability. Now, this rapport building and doing the practice interview can actually either be done at a safe place, which might be at the child's home, or it can be visually recorded. But the key element is you need to have an understanding of this child's language. And some of that information you can actually obtain before you've met the child. And in the ideal world, you would want to obtain as much information about the child, either from the protective carer or school, in terms of words they use, their language ability, their cognitive ability. You can get a lot of information from adults that engage with them already before you even meet the child. So that's, if you can, ideally you would want to do that. Because at the same time, you may also then find out that they have a communication impairment, which will give you a heads up in wanting an intermediary. But this assessment, if you're unable to get an intermediary straight away, at least meeting the child, and often we know it's the referral comes in and you've got to go straight out. So you're going to meet the child, but you need to have some form of assessment. And many officers I hear say, well, when I do the assessment, I just have a chat. But having a chat, what does that tell you? What's that going to tell you about this child's understanding of language? Part of that assessment is you being observational in terms of how they might use body language to actually show what they're telling in their behaviour, right, if they don't have the words. So you need to be mindful of that. How do they respond to question types? Do they respond well to open questions, closed questions, more specific questions? And the only way you can make that assessment is by engaging in a practice interview or practice recall. I prefer to refer it as a practice recall, because you want to be able to assess how well this child is going to respond to you speaking to them about an event. Now, you want to speak to them about a fun event, something that they may have done recently, something that's totally unrelated to the matter that you're investigating. But you want to ask them about it, and you're going to ask them questions. You might ask them time-related questions, because you want to be able to assess how well this child is going to be able to respond to your questions. How well can you understand the child's responses? And it's a way of you being able to say to yourself, I think I'm going to struggle with being able to interview this child without help. So I need an intermediary. I need an intermediary to help me interview and plan an interview with this child. And that's absolutely vital, because there is this 2-point test with regards to intermediaries, which you should all be aware of, which I shall actually come to very shortly. So what else can make you need to know around interviewing children and young people? Young children particularly will take you literally. And actually this is where I really picked up my interest around interviewing young children, was with my niece. She was 3 years old at the time. She's now 13. So this is about 10, 11 years ago. And this comes to my do not use literal language with children. You should not use literal language with children and vulnerable adults who are autistic. But certainly you should not use literal language with young children. And I was with my niece. She was staying with us, and she'd been watching In the Night Garden on television. And we'd agreed that she'd be able to do some colouring in or drawing after she'd watched her programme on TV. So when the TV programme finished, she got up and looked at me, and I said, so where would you like to go and do your colouring in? Because she could do it on the kitchen table, or she had her own sort of pink desk and chair up in her bedroom. So in my head, I'm thinking, location. Okay, where would you like to go and do some drawing? 3 years old. She looks at me, puts her head to one side and frowns and says, on paper, of course. And that response had suddenly made me realise that there is a gap in training for police officers who are interviewing children, because there is an assumption, like I said before, we treat children like little adults and assume that they have an understanding, when actually they're more likely to take us very literal, and their cognitive and psychological development is going to be a lot different. And you might say, well, why didn't I know that before? Well, actually, we hadn't been taught that before. In fact, when I was an investigator, we would never interview any child under the age of 5. That was always a rule then. Obviously, that doesn't apply now. So, yes, I'll never forget that. And that's when we changed our content of our training program to police officers in the Met who investigated child abuse, which made some difference. As I've said before, children also had difficulty with some concepts. So things like before and after, times, dates and ages. And I think the message really is that's what you would practice in your practice recall to see how well the child might respond to those types of questions. And that will help you decide how you might approach that element in your interview if you really need to. We do get hung up as interviewers on dates and times. We really do. And sometimes we have to know when to move on, because the risk is you'll get inaccurate information, which could have a real impact on your investigation and then your subsequent case in court if we're not careful. I know the CPS will probably come back to you and say, oh, can you re-interview the child and see if they can actually be more accurate around dates and times. And you may have to go back to the CPS and say, no, this is a 4-year-old child. Their development is such that blah. Or you may actually have an intermediary report that will be able to support the fact as to why it's not appropriate to be asking those types of questions. Another thing that you'll need to think about is prepositions. So behind, in front of, over, under, in, on, and they'll be very relevant to particularly sexual abuse cases, because again, we can be very pedantic of wanting to know the in and on and under and over. And actually, those types of things, prepositions, are often not really learnt or understood until a child's about 6 years old. Now, there are, obviously that's why you would need an intermediary to help you, but there are a couple of training courses that are out there that can actually also help you understand how you can assess those elements with a child or young person. When it comes to interviewing children, particularly younger children, again, try not to use pronouns. So rather than say he, she, or they, actually use the person name. So if you're going to ask a question about a person that they've mentioned, use that person's name. And if, again, with children, what's really helpful is because they might be busy drawing, you might allow some drawing. Because often young children are very easy to chat to when they're slightly distracted. But at the same time, distraction can actually completely engross them in what they're doing, and then they're not listening to you. So again, that's something you'd have to think about, as whether it's appropriate or not. But use the child's name. So if you want to get their attention, you say Anne, and then ask your question. And as I say, try not to use pronouns. So if they mention somebody's name, rather than say he, she, or they, actually use that person's name that they've mentioned. We talked about practice recall. As I've said, that helps to assess receptive and expressive language. It helps you to practice your question types and which one the child responds best to. It helps you also to introduce your ground rules. Now, you know that ground rules are very important for interviewing, and that's another area that police officers tend to spend rather a lot of time on in interview. When again, really, you need to be very simple with your ground rules, particularly with children. You still need to cover them, and you still need to cover truth and lies. I'll come to truth and lies shortly. But the ground rules of tell me if you don't know, and so on and so forth, you need to keep them really short. So say if you don't know, say if you don't understand. One of the best rules, I think, with young children is to say no guessing. Now, no guessing is good simply because in school, they'll be invited to guess. And actually in an interview, we don't want them to guess. So one of the ground rules that you'll have would be no guessing. In this room, we do no guessing. But don't have too many rules. The rules have got to match the child. And, you know, if you've got a 3-year-old, then only probably have 2 rules plus a third one, which would be your truth and lies. But don't feel that you've got to go through the whole list that is set out in the ABE guidance. And please, please don't reiterate. It's not helpful. It doesn't help the child, causes confusion. Keep it simple. You should be able to do your ground rules, introductions and ground rules within a matter of minutes, and then focus on the interview. If you spend too much time worrying about your introductions, ground rules and truth and lies, if you spend too much time on that, then you're wasting valuable time in actually obtaining the evidence that you need. So they need to be simple. You don't need to have long explanatory ground rules, just simple ones. So say you don't know, tell me if I've got it wrong, no guessing. And as I say, this one is really vital because children are encouraged to guess at school, but in an interview room, no guessing. And of course, then you have the truth and lies. And my advice is, many forces now have the Triangle Truth and Lies app, which is really, really good, very simple. It comes with instructions. But again, it's something you need to keep really, really simple. And the one biggest rule when it comes to doing truth and lies is you do not ever use the child or your adult as a character within your truth and lies example. And finally, planning. I tell you, if I had £1 for every time I told a police officer the importance of planning for interviews, I'd be a millionaire. You cannot overemphasise the need for good planning. Research is absolutely clear the importance of planning. And you know the 5 Ps. Poor planning. Planning prevents poor performance, and you really can't underestimate it. Keep calm and engaged with the child to be able to facilitate communication. And practice, as I say, the basic skills in everyday conversation. So practice your open questions with family and friends, because if it's like everything else, if you practice things, then it becomes more natural. Always be calm when you're interviewing children. Have clear foundations in place. Use short sentences. Use simple everyday words. When you're asking children questions, use in past tense. It's really important you use past tense. And you can provide scaffolds to help the children explain. That's something that intermediates will probably introduce, such as perhaps drawing, etc. Look out for child's non-verbal language, because if they don't have the words, there is non-verbal stuff that they will do that you need to keep an eye out on. Keep your pacing to the child. And finally, 2 things. Meet the child's needs, not your own. Meet the child's needs, not what your supervisor says you need to do. Very often, and I still hear officers say, just do a quick ABE and see what you get. Hold on. This is a child who's probably experienced a rather traumatic event, either singularly or a repeated event. But you want me to go and do a quick interview and see what I get because someone's in custody? How is that in the best interest of the child? They have to be the priority of all that you do and all of your thinking. And it's important to keep the child informed. It doesn't matter if they're 4 or 5 years old. It's about keeping them informed. Children are easily suggestible and will acquiesce easily. And trauma has an impact on children and adults when it comes to recalling events. So there's things like other things that you need to consider. For example, if you're going to take a child into police protection, so if you're going to invoke your power under Section 46 and take police protection on a child, then you're not going to achieve very much if you're going to take them straight to an interview suite to interview them, because they're going to have a sense of uncertainty and fear and anxiety. To then whisk them into an interview room, which I've seen done in the past, is likely not to be particularly fruitful. Another consideration is if you've got a child, young person or an adult who have experienced abuse and they've been videoed, you really have to think about whether you should be doing a visually recorded interview or how that's going to be managed, particularly when you're pointing out cameras and so on and so forth. So that's another consideration you would have to think. And when it comes to interviewing, you need to think about the environment for them. So many ABE suites out there are not child-friendly. But it needs to be comfortable for them. You need to think about toilet breaks, refreshments, allowing them perhaps to bring a soft toy in with them if it's going to give them comfort. Telling them where their carer is, whoever it is that's brought them to the interview. They need to know that whoever's brought them and they feel safe with, they can go to at any time. They might be in the family room or perhaps the room next door, wherever that might be. They need to be able to feel safe and feel that they can ask to go to them at any time. With young children, they'll need breaks, but you need to monitor their their energy levels, in essence, and have breaks. If you need to have breaks, you have breaks. So there are a huge amount of things to think about, which is why, again, intermediaries are so vital if you're not being trained specifically in how to manage those situations. Since all children have the right to be questioned with age-appropriate methods, we have to be able to develop our own investigative interviewing techniques, particularly when it comes to interviewing our young children and children with the most complex needs. We need to improve our practice so that we can meet their needs to be able to get the best evidence that we require to help and support our investigations. And after all, as a human right, they have a right to be able to have those considerations when it comes to best practice for interviewing children. And all that I've said today is in the ABE guidance. And it'll be the ABE guidance that you're more likely to be cross-examined against in terms of compliance. But it's absolutely vital that you consider all the things that I've talked about. One final thing, of course, is the time of day of your interview. No point in interviewing a child when they've been at school all day. No point in interviewing a child at 3 o'clock in the morning. You need to find a time that suits them more than that suits you. So we're going to look very quickly at free narrative and questioning. This video that I'm doing is not a training event for you. This is highlighting things that you need to be thinking about that may very well give you a realisation that you need to go and do some training so you have the skills to be able to do some of the things that I'm suggesting. When you've got that child or young person in the interview room, research is absolutely clear about the strength of free recall and the use of open questions. Now, some young children and children with communication impairments do less well with open questions, and they tend not to expand, so you have to work harder. But what I find is many officers will start off with an open question and then they close down an interview straight away because you know what you're needing to seek. You know, or you think you know, what information that you want to ascertain, when actually what we should be hearing is the child's voice, the victim's voice. And the way to do that is to be able to use open questions more often. There will be times that you'll need to narrow it down. So you might have a topic area that you need to explore. So that's when you will perhaps use more specific questions or closed questions. But then you need to come up and ask open questions again to be able to move them along the path. My advice is that you do some research around question types, and that you look at Professor Martine Powell. They're the question types: open-ended invitations, breadth and depth questions. She talks about, so Professor Martine Powell is the lady to explore when it comes to understanding question types. Police officers across England use TED questions, so tell me, explain to me, describe to me. Actually, we teach TED PIEs, which is tell me, explain to me, describe to me, precisely, in detail, exactly. The problem is, very young children may not understand the word describe, or precisely, or in detail, or exactly. So, and just because you put tell me in front of a question doesn't make it an open question. So open questions really need to be explored above and beyond TED questions, and have some understanding of what open questions really means. And that includes things like, so they may give you some information and you'll say, tell me more about that, or tell me a bit about this, or tell me what happened next, tell me what happened before. And that facilitators are really good. All those listening skills, nodding your head, can all help with a free narrative, can all help moving the child along the path. And one of the things, whilst I think about it, that's really useful to think about, and I do see officers do it quite often, is a victim or a child or young person or vulnerable adult says, and then this happened. So they've actually got to the point where they said, and then he raped me, or then he touched me, or then he or she did this, or whatever. And rather than seeing that as an open door and exploring that bit there and then, officers then want to ask direct, specific questions, or go back to an element before they've got to that part, if that makes sense. So as soon as your victim has opened a door and said, and then this happened, that's your door. That's your open door for you to go and explore there and then, not to go and ask something else. Because it would have taken a lot for that child or young person to say, and then he touched me, or then she touched me, or then he raped me. It's taken a lot for a victim or witness to get to that point. And there's your door, there's your open door. That's the time for you to explore about what happened next, or tell me more about that. Not to then go back to something else that they may have said. So that's really important. Scaffolding. Scaffolding is a framework. It's seen as a framework that supports and helps the telling. And there's a number of types of resources that can be used to support a child in their telling. And drawings and gingerbread figures are things that I've seen used and that we train, actually. And of course, I teach how officers can use those sort of things safely without leading. And intermediaries will be able to assist with that as well. Because if children and young people aren't having the words, then often we can get the detail that we want a lot quicker if we are able to use props, which is often the term used. But one of the things that we do not ever use is anatomical correct dolls. Never ever use anatomical correct dolls. And the guidance is quite clear about that, because you'd have to be specifically trained to use items such as that in sexual abuse cases. Final points on that really is communication is much more than just talking. People combine words, intonation, gesture, facial expressions, body language all the time. Be more aware of non-verbal communication. That improves your receptive and expressive skills as an interviewer. And be aware of your questions and sentences that are containing more information that's just too much to be processed. But also be mindful of your own body language, because children, or all victims or witnesses, will pick up very quickly if you're uninterested, distracted, or getting bored, or you're tired. So you need to be aware of your own body language. Well, the College of Policing has a specialist child witness course that all forces are meant to be delivering and complying, and they tend to be only focused on the detectives that are engaged in investigating child abuse. However, there are other skills that may not be taught within your force that can be explored through either attending the forensic questioning children course that's delivered by Triangle, which are based in Sussex. But also there are other elements that I've talked about, such as assessing language or screening language ability of children, which is the ABLES course, which is delivered by Alison McCulloch and an intermediary from Norfolk. It's important that you develop some understanding around child development. Contextual safeguarding is I think can be really helpful. That's a new thing at the moment, contextual safeguarding. I've already mentioned Professor Martine Powell, so read her articles. And there are a number of articles written by the late Dr. Ruth Marchant. She's written numerous articles relating to interviewing young children. So if you're keen and want to explore and do well in this type of area, then seek out this additional training, or at the very least do some reading and some research around these elements. You will always find conflicting stuff. That there's no doubt. But certainly I would research Professor Martine Powell from Australia and Dr. Ruth Marchant and look out for the articles that they've written. So continuing with what makes a good interview in terms of children and young people, part of all of that is understanding memory. We've already talked about auditory working memory. But listening skills is really important and cannot be overemphasised, particularly if you're going to interview somebody, whether it's an adult or a child, but particularly with young children, about an event that's been repeated. Sometimes we know that abusive events may be just a one-off, or it might be something that's repeated over a period of time. And therefore, when you've asked that open question, when you're starting your interview, and the person you're interviewing gives you a free narrative, you need to listen out for their gist memory or their semantic memory. I refer to it as gist because often what will happen is they will give you an overview of what's happened. If it's a repeated event, they'll give you an overview. So they may use words such as sometimes this happens, usually so-and-so does such and such. One time it happened in the bathroom. One time it happened when so-and-so was at work. So you need to listen out for that type of language being used in the free narrative that will indicate to you that, this has happened more than once. Even if we know it's happened more than once, they are going to use some gist elements to indicate to you the number of times it might have happened. So things like usually, sometimes, one time, or once. And you need to be able to listen out for that, because then that will help you focus on episodic stuff, your topics. So if they might say sometimes it's happened in the bathroom, sometimes it's happened when mummy was at work, whatever that might be, you'll know that you need to hear about one time that was in the bathroom and then one time when mummy was at work. And that they would be your topics for you to sort of scrutinise and drill down into to get more detail. So that's how you would then access their episodic memory. But at first you need to listen out for their gist memory if it's a repeated event. you only have to consider the Youth Justice Criminal Evidence Act. I think it's section 53, it might be 58, which is clear about competency. Now, when it comes to competency, and let's just remind ourselves of that, competency is the ability of the questioner being able to understand the answers given by your interviewee, and the interviewee being able to understand your questions. So there's 3 stated cases. There's one which is R.V. Watts. R.V. Watts relates to vulnerable adults, and the only way they could communicate was to say yes or no. So through using appropriate communication tools, they were able to answer and understand questions that were put to them, and they would say yes, and they'd be able to say yes or no. And the perpetrator of the sexual abuse that these adults had experienced was found guilty at court, but then it went to Court of Appeal on the basis that they weren't competent. They were not competent victims in terms of in their interviewing. They were not competent. They did not reach the competency threshold, and the judge overruled it and said yes, simply on the basis that they understood the questions that they were being asked, and the questioner understood the answers that were being given. In terms of children, there are 2 stated cases that you need to consider. One of them is R.V. Barker. You'll be able to search it on the internet, R.V. Barker and R.V. Mullicky. That also relates to competency around young children, and the same rule applies. If they can understand your questions and we can understand their answers, then they will be deemed competent. But it is about the competency of the adult rather than the competency of the child, because children can be seen as poor communicators, and there's actually a lot more that children can tell us than we actually believe. In summary, think about everything that I've said, but actually, I suppose the 2 main things, there's 3 main things. Children are not little adults. No 2 children are the same in terms of communication abilities. Read the ABE guidance section 2 and comply as best you can with the instruction within that. And if you can't comply, or you aren't able to achieve everything within terms of section 2, you need to be able to justify why and make sure that's in writing. Know and accept your own limitations and abilities, because the child's interest is paramount. And if you don't feel you can interview this child, then you find someone that can, because it's their basic human right to be given every opportunity to have their voice heard and interviewed by someone appropriately trained who can use the appropriate developmental language for that age group. And finally, really, consider all the things that I've said. But the child's welfare is paramount. The child's competence is reliant on the adult's competence when it comes to interviewing them. And it doesn't matter how old they are or their communication ability. You have the responsibility and the duty to explore every means possible to provide the environment to enable that child to tell you about their experiences. They may not, you could do all of that and they still may not tell you. But if you've done everything in your power to provide that environment and build the rapport and assess their language, etc., done all the things that we've talked about, then you've fulfilled your duty to that extent. But children still may not tell. It's not because they don't want to. It may be just that they're not ready to. So what you've heard is a huge amount of information. And there are many factors and strategies and approaches that are out there in terms of interviewing children. And your responsibility as an interviewer and an investigator is to build your knowledge, to experience and attend continual professional development read books, expand your knowledge and understanding around interview techniques, child development, etc. One of the key things that many officers never have the time to do, but to reflect on your own interviews, because that's how you can build on your own best practice, to always reflect on your interviews. As I said earlier, there's lots of factors, there's research out there. Some of it will be conflicting, some of it will be opposing, even to what I have spoken to you about today. But it needs to open your mind up to what's possible. It needs to help you realise that not only do you need to be child-centric, but you have a responsibility to give that child or young person the opportunity to be able to tell you about their adverse experience, or what it is that they've seen, or whatever you feel that they have information that they need to tell you. Because with particularly young children, they think adults already know. So sometimes with the approaches with young children is to remind them that actually I wasn't there. So you're in a way letting them know that they hold the information. You don't have that information, but it's really important for them to tell you. This really has to be child-centric and work towards what's best for them. Attached to this presentation are a number of documents and websites that will help and support your thinking and hopefully encourage you to explore even further. And one of the things that I think you'll find in terms of your exploration is question types. And currently in the UK, there's a mnemonic called TED, which I think I spoke earlier in the presentation. But there are other types of questions, and you need to practice those. You need to practice question types in your day-to-day life. So many of us will, I'm sure, have experienced when perhaps their child has come in from school and you'll say, "How was school?" And you'll get, "Yeah, it's fine, all good." "So what did you do at school?" "Oh, I can't remember." Or you might have a colleague who comes into work and been away on holiday, and you'll say, "Did you have a nice holiday?" "Yes." "Did you have a good holiday?" "Yeah, it was great, thanks." So all of that actually are closed questions. If you really want to know what your child did at school, then you would start perhaps from a different perspective. So for example, when I used to see my young niece, I used to practice my question types on her just to see what responses I'd get. And if I picked her up from nursery, I'd say, "How was nursery?" "Good." "So what did you do in nursery?" And I'd get the shrug of the shoulders. So I thought, well, okay, I'm going to start from a different perspective. So I'd say, "Who dropped you off at nursery?" "Mummy." "So when Mummy dropped you off at nursery, then what did you do?" "So I took my coat off." "Took your coat off. Then what happened?" "I went and played with my friends." "And what did you play with your friends?" And then she'd tell me. "And then what did you do? And then what happened? And what happened before this? Or what happened after that?" And as a result, I was able to get far more information about her day at nursery than I would have done by asking, "How was nursery?" So understanding the difference between open questions, closed questions, and specific closed questions is really key, which is why Professor Martine Powell is really useful to look at her website and her papers, which guides you around that. But practice, 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 practice in day-to-day, with your family, with your friends, and it'll be interesting to see how much information that you get. But you do need to build your knowledge. You do need to build your understanding and experience and reflect on your interviews. Practice your question types with your family and your friends. But the biggest thing is, don't underestimate a child's ability to tell. They may not be able to use their words, but they will find a way of telling. And you have the responsibility to support that. Because ultimately, children's competence is reliant on the adult's competence.
Thank you for watching. I hope you found this content useful. You can get access to each episode's transcript with key learning points, timestamps and references if you get yourself onto my mailing list. Just go to the main website on policesciencedoctor.com, and on the bottom of each page you will find a sign-up form for notifications of new content. Just enter your first name, your preferred email address and the type of organization you work for. You will not get any spam. This is just for me to let you know about new content and for you to get access to all the transcripts.